The purpose of this video is to give you a bit of an insight into the context of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. The key aim of this video is to give you a better understanding of how the context of the novel's production influences how it was written, particularly in 1954. So the key terms you're going to be coming across are context, the word post-apocalyptic, dystopia, and discourse. I'd like you to consider when you're thinking about context, this kind of analogy. It may not be helpful, but if we think of analogy as think of context as being a bit like the soil. Certain soils give rise to certain kinds of plants. Well, when we think about context, certain historical and social conditions give rise to certain kinds of stories. And so I'd like you to think about that kind of analogy when we're working on this video. So I Am Legend is set in a post-apocalyptic world. That means it's after some kind of end-of-the-world scenario. And the novel was written soon after World War II and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that's really important in considering the context of this novel that's written in light of that big momentous event where it became clear that human beings could literally wipe themselves out through their own science and through their own creation. The significance of this is that science and horror are often not far apart. The vampire in this novel moves from the discourse of supernatural myth to the discourse of science. And this word discourse means the patterns of language and the patterns of words that are used around a topic. So the vampire is historically spoken of in a discourse of religion and supernatural myth of the medieval period. Some kind of beast or kind of antichrist figure. But in this novel, the vampire moves into this discourse of science, the product of some kind of bacteria. What's also important to consider is this idea of the American dream. The 1950s is this period of relative safety in America in many ways. And it's written in 1954. But what's interesting is that it's set firstly in 1976, which is the year of America's bicentennial. Everything in the novel is set up in a way that has the American dream turned into a nightmare. Robert Neville's house is much like the one that's in this picture. It's an idyllic suburban house, but it's turned into a fortress to protect him from these vampires. The suburban ideal, the suburban perfection is turned into this nightmare dystopia. Another feature of the period and the concerns of the period is that in 1954, this is around the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War doesn't really have a first date. It emerges straight after World War II, and America immediately becomes afraid of the communists, and in particular Russia. There were communist witch hunts in America at the time where people were accused of being communists, and particularly in Hollywood. And to be a communist was, I guess, the most vile thing one could be. It's an enemy of the state. And so one way of looking at the vampires in this novel is that they could represent the communist other, this fear that the evil is already among us, ready to turn on us. Ben Cortman is Robert Neville's neighbour. And so he turns into this vampire, or has turned into this vampire, and these neighbours now become the enemy. That's one way of reading this. Is this intended by Richard Matheson? I don't know. I think it's an irrelevant question. This is an interpretation that could emerge by thinking about the context and the content of the novel together. Changing contexts are important to consider because in this case the vampire can be reinterpreted in new readers' context in terms of any group that threatens the status quo. We can read I Am Legend in the 60s and think of these vampires as the hippies, the young people who are taking over and destroying the world. We could take I Am Legend and reinterpret them as being some kind of Islamic threat that is now the other that we consider, that the West is so afraid of, whatever that terrorist threat. So basically the vampire can be reinterpreted to be any kind of existential threat that the people in the context can take hold of. So I hope that gives you a bit of an understanding of context. It's a very short way of looking at it, but it's there to help sow the seeds, I guess, of the kind of understandings that you need in order to look at a novel, in particular I Am Legend, in terms of the world in which it was created. So good luck with that.